The Montana air in the autumn of 1878 carried the scent of pine and the sharp promise of an early snow. It was a thin, clean smell, one that Eleanor Whitlow breathed in as if it were a tonic for a soul weary of city smoke and coal dust. She followed the path that ran alongside Pine Creek, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, a carpet of fallen needles cushioning her steps. The water moved with a quiet insistence, whispering over smooth, gray stones the color of a winter sky. It was cold. The creek, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to rise from its bed and seep into the very air, clinging to the mist that hovered just above the surface. The mist was like a memory made visible, she thought, a ghost of the night that refused to yield to the pale morning sun. She had been in Pine Hollow for 2 months, long enough for the initial shock of the place to settle into a dull, persistent ache of loneliness. The town was little more than a wound in the wilderness, a handful of rough-hewn cabins and a muddy track that served as the main street. It was a place built on gold and grit, where the lives of men were measured in the weight of the dust they pulled from the earth and the whiskey they poured down their throats. She was the town's new schoolteacher, sent from Boston by a well-meaning but misguided missionary society to bring letters and sums to the children of miners. They were pale, ragged children with old eyes, who knew more of rock falls and dynamite than of poetry and psalms. Each morning, she walked this path. It was a ritual, a small piece of order in a world that felt chaotic and immense. Back home, her world had been one of fences and brick walls, of clocks that chimed the hours with steadfast certainty. Here, time was measured by the slow crawl of shadows across the valley floor and the relentless turning of the seasons. The wilderness pressed in on all sides, a vast, silent presence that made her feel impossibly small, a single, misplaced stitch in a tapestry she could not comprehend. The water murmured its endless, secret language. Eleanor paused, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The creek reminded her of Arthur. The memory was sharp and sudden, like a shard of glass in the heart. He had loved the water, the wild rivers of Virginia where they had planned to build their life. He had spoken of it with a poet's reverence, of its power to cleanse and to carry things away. The war had carried him away instead. A piece of shrapnel near a place called Bull Run had torn through the future they had so carefully sketched, leaving her with nothing but letters filled with ghosts of promises and a faith that had grown as thin and brittle as old paper. She had stopped praying, not out of anger, but out of a profound and hollow emptiness. It seemed the sky had gone silent, and she had no words left for it anyway. The people of Pine Hollow were kind enough in their rough, distracted way. They called her Miss Whitlow and tipped their hats, but their eyes held a deep-seated weariness that kept the world at a distance. They were suspicious of her books, her proper speech, her quiet sorrow. She was an outsider, a bird with the wrong feathers, and she knew she would always be one. They saw her as fragile, a piece of porcelain set down in a blacksmith's shop. They did not see the iron spine that had held her up when her world collapsed, the resolve that had carried her 2,000 miles to this forsaken edge of the country. She had come here not to save the souls of children, as the society had hoped, but to see if there was anything left of her own to salvage. She had hoped the sheer, stark beauty of the land might fill the spaces that grief had carved out. Sometimes, in moments like this, with the pines towering over her like silent green cathedrals, she felt a flicker of it, a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. She watched a dipper, a small, dark bird, bob on a rock in the middle of the current before plunging into the icy water. It emerged a moment later, triumphant, and flew off into the trees. How brave, to throw itself into the cold like that. She felt a kinship with the creek. It was a vessel of memory, its currents pulling at the past. The chill that rose from it was the chill of the morning the telegram arrived, the cold of the earth in the churchyard. The water was a constant, moving thing, yet it held the stillness of loss. It flowed on, but it never forgot the rocks that shaped its course. Lost in thought, She stepped on a stone slick with a thin, treacherous film of moss. Her foot slid out from under her with shocking speed. A small cry escaped her lips as her balance failed. She flailed, her hands grasping at the empty air, and then she was falling. The world tilted, a dizzying blur of green pines and gray sky, before the cold seized her. It was not a gentle immersion. It was a violent, breathless shock. A blow that knocked the air from her lungs and drove the blood from her skin. The water was colder than she could have ever imagined. A liquid steel that clamped around her chest and stole her strength. Her heavy wool skirt became a leaden weight, dragging her down, tangling around her legs like grasping hands. The current, so placid from the bank, was a powerful, insistent force, pulling her away from the shore, tumbling her over unseen rocks that bruised her knees and hips. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the initial shock. She gasped for air but took in a mouthful of frigid water that burned its way down her throat. She coughed, sputtering, her head breaking the surface for a moment before the current pulled her under again. The sunlight above was a warped, wavering ceiling of silver. The sound of the world was gone, replaced by the roaring in her own ears. This is it, she thought, a strange, detached calm settling over the terror. This is how it ends. Not in a warm bed surrounded by loved ones, but alone in an anonymous creek in the middle of nowhere. Her life felt distant, a story about someone else. Arthur's face flashed in her mind, his smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. Then there was only the cold, a great and final emptiness. Her body, fighting on instinct, struggled toward the light. Her boots scraped against gravel. She managed to get her feet under her for a second, pushing up, her head and shoulders breaking the surface once more. She saw the bank, impossibly far. She was weak, her limbs numb and heavy. The cold was deep in her bones now, a lethargy that was almost peaceful. It would be so easy to let go, to let the water take her, to finally be still. It was then that she saw him. He was a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the pines on the far bank, a figure of a man, moving with a fluid silence that was not entirely human. He entered the water without a sound, the creek parting before him as if it knew him. For a heart-stopping second, her mind, fractured by cold and fear, registered only a threat. The stories she had heard in town, whispered over campfires and in the saloon, rushed back, tales of renegades, of warriors from the Crow tribe driven from their lands, their hearts filled with bitterness, wanted men with bounties on their heads. They said their eyes were like chips of obsidian and their hands knew only violence. But there was no time for fear. Her strength was gone. Her head slipped beneath the churning surface again, the silver light dimming to a murky gray. She felt herself drifting, untethering from the world. And then hands were on her. They were strong, impossibly strong. Seizing her arm, her waist. They were not gentle, but they were certain. They pulled her up, breaking the water's hold with an authority that was absolute. Her head came clear of the water, and she took a ragged, shuddering breath that was half sob, half gasp. She was being lifted, drawn from the creek as if she'd weighed nothing at all. He set her on the bank, on the soft bed of pine needles, laying her down carefully. She lay there, shivering uncontrollably, water streaming from her hair and clothes. She looked up at him through a haze of confusion and exhaustion. He stood over her, a silhouette against the pale light filtering through the trees. Water dripped from his dark, shoulder-length hair and from the leather of his leggings. He was tall and lean, built of sinew and bone, a man made of the mountains themselves. His face was stark, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, his skin the color of burnished copper. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark as the rumors had claimed. But they were not flat or cold. They were deep, alive with a light that seemed to come from some ancient, knowing place. They were like the night given a soul. He knelt beside her. She saw his hands then. They were large and rough, the knuckles calloused, the fingers long and capable. Scars, old and new, mapped the skin. They were the hands of a warrior, a hunter, a man who lived by his strength. Yet it was these hands that had just pulled her from the numbing embrace of the creek. He reached out, not to harm her, but to gently push the wet hair back from her face. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, it made her breath catch. In that moment, everything else fell away. The roaring in her ears subsided, replaced by the quiet drip of water from the pine boughs and the soft murmur of the creek. The violent shivering that racked her body seemed to fade into a distant tremor. The cold was still there, a deep ache in her bones, but it was no longer the only thing she could feel. She could feel the solid earth beneath her, the rough texture of his fingers against her skin, the startling intensity of his gaze. The world, which had been a rushing, chaotic torrent only moments before, narrowed to this single, still point. Time itself seemed to hesitate, to pause and hold its breath. Caught in the space between the man who had saved her and the woman who had been saved, there on the muddy bank of a cold Montana creek beneath the pines. The light was strange, a thin and watery thing that filtered through the mist and the dense canopy of the pines. It caught the beads of water clinging to the black strands of his hair, turning them for a moment into a constellation of tiny, cold stars. He was still, watching her with an unnerving patience, his dark eyes holding hers. They were not the eyes of a wild animal, she thought, not filled with the flat, predatory gleam she had seen in the eyes of wolves and coyotes. They were deep, like looking down a well at midnight, and in their depths was a stillness that was ancient, a profound quiet that seemed to have absorbed all the sounds of the forest. He was the man from the pines, a part of the landscape, as natural and as dangerous as a sudden rock slide or a winter storm. A violent shiver racked her body, a desperate attempt by her blood to find warmth. The man's gaze shifted, a flicker of concern in that vast stillness. He made a low sound in his throat, a language of earth and air that she did not understand. Yet the meaning was clear. It was a question. Are you hurt? Her mind, slowly beginning to clear, was a maelstrom of fear and confusion. And then, like a piece of ice forming in the pit of her stomach, came the cold shock of recognition. It was not his face precisely, but the totality of him. The long hair, the cast of his features, the buckskin leggings. He matched the description on the poster nailed to the wall of the general store in Pine Hollow. A crude drawing, a list of offenses, and a name she could not pronounce. Tawena, a Crow warrior, wanted for the raid on the Miller homestead, for the fire that had taken a man and his wife. The bounty was $500, a fortune in a town where men risked their lives for a few dollars worth of gold dust a day. Every instinct honed by her upbringing, by the fearful whispers of the townsfolk, screamed at her to scramble away, to run, to scream for help. This was a killer, a savage. The boogeyman the miners used to frighten their children into obedience. The man on the poster was a monster, painted in broad, terrified strokes of rumor and hearsay. He was the reason men in Pine Hollow carried their rifles even when they went to the saloon. He was the embodiment of the fear that haunted the edges of their small, defiant civilization. But the man before her, the man whose presence was as solid and real as the cold ground beneath her, had just pulled her from the water. He had lifted her with a strength that could have easily broken her, yet he had set her down as if she were made of glass. The memory of the creek's icy grip was still fresh, a terror that left no room for the imagined horrors of a wanted poster. Her own senses, her own experience of the last few minutes, were at war with everything she had been told. There was no menace in his posture, no cruelty in his gaze. There was only a grave, watchful calm. Her heart, which had been pounding with a frantic, panicked rhythm, began to slow. Her body still trembled with cold, but the terror was beginning to recede, replaced by a bewildering and dangerous curiosity. He must have seen the conflict in her eyes. He took a half step back, giving her space, a gesture of peace that was unmistakable. He was letting her choose her own fear. She pushed herself up into a sitting position, her sodden dress clinging to her, making her feel heavy and helpless. As she moved, a sharp pain shot through her left wrist. She must have hit it on a rock when she fell. She winced, cradling it with her right hand. He saw the flicker of pain in her face. He moved forward again, his step silent on the carpet of needles. He knelt before her once more, his eyes on her injured wrist. He made a small motion with his head, a questioning tilt, asking for permission. Eleanor hesitated for only a second. Her mind still screamed a warning, but a deeper, quieter part of her, the part that had felt his hands lift her from the cold, gave a silent assent. She held out her arm. His fingers, warm from his own body, closed around her wrist. She felt the rough texture of his calloused skin against her own, which was slick and cold from the creek. His hands were weapons. She could see the history of violence in the scars, the strength in the set of his knuckles. They were hands that could hunt and fight and kill, and yet the way he held her was with an impossible gentleness. His thumb moved in a slow, careful circle, probing the tender flesh, searching for the source of the pain. The pressure was firm but exquisitely controlled. It was a touch that understood hurt. It was a touch gentler than any prayer she had uttered in years, more real and more comforting than the silent, empty heavens she had railed against since Arthur's death. In that moment, the wanted poster and the whispers of the town seemed like lies spun from a different, meaner world. He met her eyes, and she saw something else in their depths now. It was not pity, but a shared understanding of pain. He gave a slight shake of his head, as if to say it was not broken. Then his gaze traveled down, and for the first time, Eleanor noticed the dark, wet stain on the side of his buckskin shirt. A crude bandage, little more than a strip of cloth, was soaked through with blood. He was injured, badly. The realization shifted everything. He was not just a savior or a fugitive. He was a man in need. He had entered the freezing water to save her, a stranger, while he himself was wounded. The scales of debt, of humanity, tipped decisively in her mind. She could not leave him here. To do so would be to leave him to the cold, to his wound, or to the men from Pine Hollow who would hunt him for money, who would see the drawing on the poster and not the man who stood before them. It would be a betrayal not only of him, but of the small, flickering ember of her own conscience. "You are hurt," she said, the words coming out in a shaky whisper. He did not understand the words, but he understood her gaze fixed on his side. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. She had to get them both out of the open. She had to get them somewhere warm, somewhere safe. Her own cabin was out of the question. Someone would surely see, but there was another place. A place she had found on one of her long, lonely walks. An old trapper's cabin, set deep in a thicket of aspen about a mile up the creek, long abandoned. The roof was mostly intact. The door still hung on its leather hinges. It was not much, but it was shelter. It was concealment. She got to her feet, her legs unsteady, her sodden clothes weighing her down. She pointed up the creek, away from the town. "There," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "A cabin. Shelter." He watched her, his expression unreadable. She took a step, then another, showing him the direction. She looked back, her eyes pleading. "Please, trust me." He stood for a long moment, a statue carved from the wilderness. He was weighing his own risks. She knew. She was a white woman, from the town that wanted him dead. Helping her could be a trap, but he had seen the truth in her eyes, just as she had seen it in his. He had seen past her fear, and she had seen past his reputation. Finally, he gave another one of those short, decisive nods. He took a step to follow her, and she saw him falter, his hand pressing against his wounded side. Without thinking, she went to him, putting her shoulder under his arm, taking on some of his weight. He was surprisingly heavy, all lean muscle and solid bone. He smelled of pine and wet leather and the faint, coppery scent of blood. The contact was shocking in its intimacy. She, Eleanor Whitlow, the proper schoolteacher from Boston, was standing in the Montana wilderness, supporting a wounded, wanted man, leading him to a secret hiding place. It was madness. It was the most alive, the most purposeful she had felt in years. Together, they turned their backs on the creek and disappeared into the deep, forgiving shadows of the pines. The journey to the abandoned cabin was a blur of struggle and desperate resolve. Every step was an effort, her waterlogged skirt a cold, heavy shroud, his weight a solid, grounding presence against her side. The cabin was as she remembered it, a sagging shape of weathered logs half reclaimed by the forest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, but it was dry. It was a haven. She helped him to the floor, easing him down against the far wall. His face was pale beneath its copper tone, a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the chill. His breathing was shallow. She worked quickly, her numb fingers fumbling with the flint and steel from the small survival kit she always carried on her walks. She gathered dry leaves and twigs from a corner where the roof had held, and soon, a small, hesitant flame flickered to life in the stone hearth. It was a fragile miracle against the encroaching gloom. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, a language spoken without words. Communication was a tapestry woven from gestures, from the pointing of a finger, the tilt of a head, the expression in their eyes. She learned that a flat hand held out meant stop or wait. He learned that her soft touch on his forehead was a question about his fever. They were like two people from different worlds, stranded on a tiny island of circumstance, slowly charting the unknown territory of each other. She would leave before dawn each morning, a ghost slipping back to her own cabin to maintain the fiction of her normal life, to feed her chickens, to be seen by any early rising miner. Then, with a basket of stolen food, a heel of bread, some dried meat, and herbs from her small garden, she would slip back into the woods. The risk was a constant, sharp taste in her mouth, but the thought of leaving him alone and wounded was impossible. His world was one of signs and meanings she had never known existed. One morning, he led her a short way from the cabin, his movements still stiff from his injury, but imbued with a silent grace. He knelt, pointing to the damp earth. She saw only a jumble of disturbed leaves. He traced a shape in the dirt with his finger, a delicate, cloven hoof. Then he held up two fingers, pointed to the track, and then pointed east, his hand mimicking the gentle, browsing movement of a deer's head. He was telling her a doe and a fawn had passed this way not long ago. He taught her to listen not just to the sounds of the forest, but to its silences. He would cock his head, his body utterly still, and she would learn to hear the subtle shift in the wind that meant rain was coming, or the sudden quiet that signaled a predator nearby. He was a part of this world, and she was a clumsy, ignorant visitor. Her world was one of symbols and paper. In the long afternoons, as the light slanted through the single grimy window of the cabin, she would teach him hers. She took a piece of charcoal from the fire and, on a smooth piece of pine bark, she drew a simple shape of a bird. She said the word bird slowly, pointing from her drawing to the finches flitting outside. He repeated it, the sound unfamiliar on his tongue but clear. She then wrote the letters, B-I-R-D. He watched, his dark eyes intense, as if he were memorizing not just the shapes, but the very magic that allowed such small scratchings to hold the meaning of a living thing. She taught him her name, guiding his large, rough hand as he gripped the charcoal. His fingers, so sure and deft when tying a knot or skinning a rabbit he had snared, were clumsy with this new tool. But he was a patient student. He traced the letters of her name, Eleanor, again and again, his touch on the bark growing more confident. Then it was his turn. He took the charcoal and in bold, clean strokes, he wrote a name that was not Tawina. He wrote Kuruk. He pointed to himself. It was his true name. She understood. Tawena was the name on the poster, the name given to him by his enemies. Karuk was the man. His story came in fragments, pieces of a broken past offered up in the quiet trust that had grown between them. He communicated through gestures, through the raw emotion in his eyes, and with the few English words he was beginning to learn. He told her of a day of smoke and fire, of the blue coats of soldiers moving through his village. He drew a picture in the dust on the cabin floor, a stick figure of a soldier with a rifle, another of a woman falling. Then he drew a small shape, a child, alone and crying amid the chaos. He pointed to himself, then drew his own figure running, not away from the soldiers, but toward the child. He sketched himself lifting the child, carrying them to the safety of the trees. But his drawing did not end in heroism. He drew other soldiers pointing at him, their faces angry. He drew his own people, their expressions a mixture of fear and accusation. Betrayer, white man's friend. The words were not spoken, but she heard them in the bitter line of his mouth. He had saved an enemy's child, and in the blind hatred of the moment, he had been condemned by both sides. A man without a people, a ghost hunted by two worlds. He was not a murderer. He was a man who had chosen compassion in a time of war, and had been rewarded with exile. The nights grew colder. Rain came, a steady, relentless drumming on the cabin roof that went on for days, sealing them inside. The world shrank to the small circle of firelight, to the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The enforced closeness was a new kind of intimacy. Stripping away the last of their pretenses, they were just two people, a man and a woman, taking shelter from the storm. His wound had begun to fester. On the third night of the rain, his fever returned, and she knew she had to clean it properly. She heated water over the fire, her heart a tight knot of apprehension. She told him what she must do, using a mix of her words and his gestures. He watched her, his eyes clouded with pain but clear with trust, and nodded. He sat with his back against the log wall as she knelt before him. Her hands trembled as she began to unwrap the soiled bandage. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with his injury. It was the awareness of their proximity, of the rain that isolated them, of the quiet vulnerability that lay between them. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the planes of his face, making the hollows of his cheeks seem deeper, his mouth more severe. When the last layer of cloth came away, she fought to keep her composure. The wound was angry, the flesh around it red and swollen. She dipped a clean rag into the hot water, her movements slow and deliberate. When she touched the cloth to his skin, he flinched, a sharp intake of breath, his only sound. She murmured to him, soft, meaningless words of comfort, the way one might soothe a frightened animal or a feverish child. She worked in silence, cleaning the injury with a tenderness that felt like a confession. She was keenly aware of every detail of him, the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the corded muscle of his abdomen tensing against the pain, the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. This was not the fearsome warrior from the wanted poster. This was not the silent, watchful stranger from the pines. This was a man made of flesh and blood, who felt pain and who bled. Just as she did, the barriers of language, of culture, of fear, they were all dissolving in the dim, fire-lit intimacy of the cabin. When she finished, she looked up and found him watching her. His gaze so direct, so profound, it felt as though he could see straight into the bruised and lonely corners of her soul. The space between them crackled with an unspoken understanding, a connection forged in shared danger and quiet compassion. The drumming of the rain on the roof was the only sound, a heartbeat for the silent world they had created. A gust of wind rattled the cabin door and sent a cold draft snaking across the floor. It moaned through the tops of the great pines outside, a long, sorrowful sound that spoke of wilderness and solitude. And in that sound, a profound realization settled over Eleanor, as quiet and as certain as the falling rain. Karuk was not the other, the savage, the alien creature the world had named him. He was a reflection of her own brokenness, her own exile. She was hiding from the ghost of a lost love, from a faith that had abandoned her. He was hiding from the injustice of men, from a world that had branded him a criminal for an act of mercy. He was just a human being, and so was she. Two people, adrift and alone, seeking shelter from a world that no longer felt like home. The fragile peace of their hidden world was shattered by the sound of shod horses. It was a sound that did not belong in the deep woods, a rhythmic, metallic intrusion that spoke of the world of men, of order and of violence. Eleanor was on her way back to the cabin, her basket filled with a meager portion of bread and cheese. When she heard it, she froze, melting back into the shadows of the aspens, her heart hammering against her ribs. 4 riders, their blue uniforms stark against the autumn colors, were making their way up the main track into Pine Hollow. They rode with a grim purpose, their face set and hard, rifles resting easy in the crooks of their arms. A patrol. They were not simple prospectors or merchants. They were the law. She waited until they had passed before hurrying to the cabin, her mind racing. Karuk was standing in the doorway when she arrived, his posture tense. He had heard them too. He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw the same question that was screaming in her own mind. Are they here for me? She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The sanctuary they had built felt suddenly as flimsy as a spider's web. The presence of the soldiers lit a fever in Pine Hollow. Fear and greed, a potent combination, spread through the muddy street like a contagion. The $500 bounty on the man called Tawina was no longer a piece of paper on a wall. It was a tangible prize, brought within reach by the arrival of armed authority. Men who had previously spoken of the renegade in hushed, fearful tones now spoke with a swaggering bravado. They gathered in front of the saloon, their voices loud, boasting of what they would do with the money, how they would track the savage down. They were hungry for a resolution, for a clear and simple act of violence that would make them feel safe again. But there was another current in the town, a quieter one. It was in the worried glances the women cast her way, in the way Martha, the storekeeper's wife, pressed a small bag of whorehound candies into her hand and told her to take care of herself. They had all noticed the change in her these past weeks. They saw the new shadows under her eyes, the way she startled at loud noises, the thinness of her frame. They whispered among themselves. They knew she had nearly drowned in the creek, that she had been pulled out by a stranger. They connected her decline to that event, spinning tales of a lingering sickness from the cold water, of a fright that had unsettled her mind. Some looked at her with pity, seeing a fragile woman broken by the harshness of the land. Others watched her with a narrow, suspicious curiosity. She had become a puzzle, a disturbance in the town's rough equilibrium. The marshal, a man named Thompson, whose tired eyes had seen too much of the West's casual brutality, came for her that afternoon. He found her in the small schoolhouse, ostensibly tidying up, though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold a book. "Miss Whitlow," he said, his voice a low rumble. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that did little to soften the authority of his presence. "I need to ask you a few questions." She faced him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to still their trembling. "Marshal, the Army Patrol is here looking for the Crow renegade, Tawina. They have reason to believe he is hiding somewhere in this valley." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the dusty air of the schoolroom. "Folks say you had an encounter down at the creek some weeks back, that a man pulled you from the water." Here it was, the moment she had been dreading. The truth was a dangerous, impossible thing. The lie was a cliff's edge. She took a slow breath. "Yes, I slipped. The current was strong." "And the man who helped you, Miss Whitlow, could you describe him?" It was not a question. It was a command. She looked past him, out the small window at the tops of the pines that guarded her secret. She thought of Karuk, of the trust in his eyes, of his hands, so rough and yet so gentle. She thought of his story, of a good deed punished by 2 worlds. She could not betray him. She would not. It all happened so fast. "Marshall," she began, her voice a carefully constructed vessel of feminine frailty. "I was in the water. I could not breathe." It was all a blur of cold and panic. "But you must have seen him." Thompson pressed, his gaze steady. Was he a white man? Was he an Indian? The word hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation. She let a tear, a genuine tear born of fear and desperation, trace a path down her cheek. He was a native man. I think tall, his hair was long and dark. She was feeding him pieces of the truth, baiting the trap. A flicker of triumph in the marshal's eyes. "That sounds like our man." "But there was an accident," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She looked at him now, her eyes wide with a feigned, remembered horror. "After he pulled me to the bank, he tried to cross the creek himself. The rocks were so slick. He fell. The current, it is so powerful there. It took him." Marshall Thompson's expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to professional disappointment. "It took him... What do you mean?" "He went under," she whispered, the lie flowing from her now with a terrible, convincing ease. "I saw his head come up once, far downstream, and then nothing. He was gone. I waited. I called out, but he was gone." She pressed a hand to her mouth, choking back a sob that was only half an act. "He saved my life. And then the water took him. He drowned in the creek." The words felt like stones in her mouth, a desecration of the place where her new life had begun. She was using the memory of her own salvation to condemn him to a fictional death, to bury him under the weight of her words. The marshal stared at her for a long time. She met his gaze, forcing herself not to look away, to let him see the convincing grief in her eyes. He was searching for the crack in her story, the telltale sign of deceit. But all he saw was the pale, distraught schoolteacher, a woman from the East who was clearly unsuited to this savage land. "Finally," he sighed, a weary sound of resignation. A man could drown in that creek easy enough. He conceded, especially if he was in a hurry. He put his hat back on his head. "I'm sorry to have troubled you, Miss Whitlow. I am sorry for your loss." When he was gone, she sank onto one of the small student benches, her body trembling with the aftermath of the lie. She had done it. She had turned them away. But the cost was a cold, salty sickness in her soul. She had spoken death into the world to protect a life. That evening, as dusk began to bleed purple and gray into the sky, she felt an irresistible pull toward the creek. She had to go back. She had to see the place she had so vividly described as a tomb. The air was cool and damp, the mist already rising from the water, swirling around the smooth, dark stones. The sound of the current was a low, mournful whisper, as if it knew of the lie she had told, as if it was mourning the man she had pretended it had claimed. She stood on the bank where he had laid her down, the pine needles a soft carpet under her feet. This was the place, the beginning. She looked across the water, her heart a heavy, aching thing in her chest. She had saved him, for now, but she had also pushed him further away, entombing him in a lie that she could never take back. They were more separated than ever. And then she saw him. He was standing on the opposite bank, half hidden in the deepening shadows of the great pines, as still as the trees themselves. He was not a ghost. He was solid, real, a silent sentinel in the twilight. The mist swirled around his feet, making it seem as if he were floating. A spirit of the forest come to watch over the water. He must have been waiting for her. He must have known she would come. He did not wave. He did not call out. He simply stood and looked at her, across the rushing water, across the divide of their two worlds. Their gazes met and held, in that silent, prolonged stare. Everything was said. She saw in his posture an acknowledgement of her sacrifice, a deep, resonant gratitude that needed no words. And he, in turn, must have seen the truth in her eyes. the confession of a feeling that had taken root in the most dangerous of soils, a love that had been born not in sunshine and laughter, but in the cold water of the creek and the shadow of the gallows. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing, this connection that had grown between them, a fragile wildflower blooming on the edge of a cliff. The peril had not extinguished it. It had been the very thing that made it grow. Standing there, on opposite sides of the creek that had both nearly killed her and brought her to life, Eleanor Whitlow knew, with a certainty that shook her to her very core, that she was lost, or perhaps, for the very first time, she was found. The patrol moved on, and the first snows of winter followed soon after, a silent white wave that swept down from the high peaks and settled over the valley. The world was transformed. Its sharp edges softened, its colors muted to shades of gray and white and the deep, abiding green of the pines. The snow was a blessing and a curse. It erased tracks, theirs and those of the men who might hunt them. But it also made their isolation profound, absolute. The trapper's cabin was no longer safe enough, too exposed, too easily discovered by a chance hunter. Karuk led her to a new shelter, a place he must have known all along. A shallow cave hidden behind a frozen waterfall, its entrance shrouded by the thick, drooping boughs of ancient spruce trees. It was a den, a primal place of rock and shadow, but with a fire burning in a carefully vented hollow. It became their world. Their life narrowed to the simple, brutal necessities of survival. Time, which had once been measured for Eleanor by the chiming of a clock and the ringing of a school bell, was now marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the deepening of the snow, the gnawing ache of hunger in her belly. Her old life, the life of books and quiet contemplation, felt like a distant dream, a story she had read about someone else. The woman who had been afraid of a mouse in her Boston apartment was gone, replaced by a woman who could help snare a rabbit and clean it with steady hands, who knew the difference between the track of a deer and that of a wolf. In the long, dark hours of the winter, their two worlds began to truly merge. Karuk's faith was not contained in a book or recited in a church. It was in the air he breathed, in the earth he walked upon. He taught her that the water was not just water. It had a spirit, a memory. He would take her to the edge of the frozen creek and have her listen to the new sounds it made, the groans and creaks of the ice, the muffled gurgle of the current trapped beneath. He told her this was the water's winter voice, a slower, deeper language. He showed her how to read the stories the ancestors had left, not in words, but in the shapes of the mountains against the sky, in the way the wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the aspens. For him, God was not an unseen king on a distant throne. The divine was in the courage of the hawk, the resilience of the pine tree, the steadfastness of the stone. His was a world alive with spirits. And slowly, Eleanor began to feel it too. It was a faith that did not require blind belief, only a willingness to open your eyes and listen. It filled a space inside her that her old religion, with its silent, absent God, had left hollow and echoing. For her, he undertook a different kind of learning. He saw the way she would sometimes fall quiet, her eyes distant, and he knew she was thinking of her past, of the man she had lost. He saw the small, worn Bible she had brought with her, a book she never read but always kept close, a relic of a life she could not entirely discard. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he picked it up, his rough fingers gentle on the fragile pages. He pointed to the black marks, then looked at her. "Teach," he said, one of the words she had taught him. And so, she began to teach him her language of faith. She did not preach or try to convert him. She simply gave him the words, because he had asked, because he was trying to understand the shape of her own specific sorrow. She chose the simplest prayer she knew, the one her mother had taught her as a child. "Our Father," she would say, her voice soft in the quiet of their cave. "Our Father," he would repeat, his voice a low rumble, the sounds foreign and clumsy on his tongue. "Who art in heaven?" she continued. "Who art in heaven?" he echoed, his dark eyes fixed on her face, not looking toward the sky but at her, as if she were the source and meaning of the words. He was not praying to her God. She knew that. He was learning the language of her heart, the cadence of her grief. He was reaching across the chasm of their different worlds to hold this piece of her, to give her back a part of herself she thought she had lost forever. It was an act of such profound tenderness, of such selfless love, that it brought tears to her eyes. He was building a bridge, and she was walking across it, leaving the barren land of her past behind. The deep cold of January settled in, locking the land in a grip of iron and ice. Resources grew scarce. The rabbits were harder to find. The deer had moved to lower ground. One afternoon, checking a line of snares she had set along the creek, Eleanor found herself on a stretch of ice that looked deceptively thick. She was further from their shelter than she usually ventured, drawn by the hope of finding a fresh track. She took a step, and then another, her boots crunching on the snow-covered surface. There was a sudden, sickening crack, a sound like a gunshot in the profound silence of the winter forest. The world gave way beneath her. This time, there was no tumbling current, no struggle toward the light. There was only the initial, violent shock of the cold, 100 times more brutal than before, and then the dark, suffocating weight of the water under the ice. She was trapped. Her head hit the underside of the ice sheet, a solid, unyielding ceiling. Panic, absolute and primal, seized her. She twisted, her hands clawing at the smooth, frozen barrier. But there was nothing to hold. The water was a black, paralyzing cold that stole the breath from her lungs and the strength from her limbs in an instant. Her heavy winter clothes were an anchor, dragging her down into the crushing darkness. This was a different kind of dying. It was quicker, more final. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges turning gray. A strange peace began to settle over the terror. She thought of Karuk. His face filled her mind. Not the face of a stranger who had pulled her from the water, but the face of the man who had shared his fire, his food, his world, the man who had learned her prayers. Her last thought was not of Arthur, or of God, or of the life she had lost. It was his name, Karuk. And then, the world exploded in a shower of light and sound. The ice above her shattered. A hand, his hand, plunged through the freezing water and seized the collar of her coat. She was being pulled up, out of the blackness, into the blinding, painful light of the snow-covered world. He hauled her from the water, his face a mask of desperate, savage intensity. He had smashed through the ice with a heavy rock, his own hands raw and bleeding from the effort. He lifted her into his arms, and for the second time in her life, standing on the bank of Pine Creek, time stopped. The world narrowed to the pounding of his heart against her ear, the strength of his arms around her, the fierce, protective light in his eyes. But this time, there was no fear. There was no bewildered shock, no terror of the stranger from the pines. This time, there was only a profound and overwhelming sense of homecoming. She was not just being saved from the freezing water. She was being saved from the cold, empty life that had come before it. He was saving her from the ghost of the woman she used to be, the woman who had walked the edge of this creek lost in a fog of memory and grief. That woman had drowned today, under the ice. The woman who lay in his arms was someone new, someone who had been forged in the fire of his care and the stillness of their shared solitude. He carried her back to their shelter, his long, powerful strides eating up the distance. He did not seem to notice her weight, or the biting wind, or the blood dripping from his own hands. His entire being was focused on the single, desperate task of keeping her alive. In the cave, he stripped her of her frozen clothes with a frantic, impersonal urgency, wrapping her in every dry fur and blanket they possessed. He built the fire up until it was a roaring blaze, and then he lay down beside her, wrapping his own body around hers, transferring his own vital warmth into her shivering, half-conscious form. She drifted in and out of awareness, aware of the heat of the fire on her face, the solid, living warmth of him against her back, his steady breathing a promise in the darkness. When she finally woke, it was full night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. He was sitting up, watching her, his face haggard in the soft red light. He had not slept. She reached out a hand, her own, and laid it against his cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a shudder running through his powerful frame. It was a gesture of profound relief, of a fear so deep it could not be put into words. She did not need words anymore. She had learned the language of the river. It was a language of survival, of shared warmth against the killing cold. It was the language of a love that did not need promises or protestations, for it was as real and as solid as the rock that sheltered them, and as constant as the water that flowed, even now, silent and unseen, beneath the ice. The thaw came in early March, a slow, grudging retreat of winter. The snow melted. The creek began to break free from its icy prison, and the world dripped with a steady, monotonous rhythm. For Eleanor and Karuk, the change brought both relief and a new, sharp-edged anxiety. The end of the deep snow meant the paths and trails would be open again. The world, which had held them in its quiet, white embrace, was waking up, and with it, all of its dangers. Their supplies were nearly gone, the last of the salted meat, the handful of dried beans. Eleanor knew she had to risk a trip to the edge of town, to Martha's store, to buy flour and salt, to be seen, to maintain the fiction that she was still just the quiet schoolteacher. She chose a gray, overcast morning, the kind that kept most people by their fires. She left Karuk in their hidden shelter, a silent promise to return passing between them in a single, prolonged look. The walk to Pine Hollow was unnerving. The familiar path seemed menacing now, every snapped twig, every chattering squirrel a potential threat. As she neared the town, a smell reached her that was wrong. It was not the familiar scent of wood smoke from the town's chimneys. It was sharper, more acrid. It was the smell of something consuming itself. Then came the sounds, not the rhythmic ring of the blacksmith's hammer or the distant rumble of the mine, but the sharp crack of gunfire and a chorus of raw, brutal shouting. Panic seized her. She darted off the path, crouching behind a thicket of willows that bordered the creek. Through the branches, she could see Pine Hollow, and it was a scene from a nightmare. Strange men on horseback were riding through the muddy street, their face bearded and cruel. They were not soldiers. They were dressed in a motley collection of greasy buckskins and worn wool, and they moved with a feral, predatory energy. They were firing their rifles into the air, into the doors of cabins, their laughter sharp and ugly. A group of them was dragging sacks from the general store, while another was setting a torch to the roof of the saloon. Pine Hollow was under attack. Eleanor's blood ran cold. These were not warriors fighting for their land. This was chaos for its own sake, for profit. She recognized them for what they were from the grim tales whispered by travelers. Scalp hunters, men who profited from conflict, who were paid bounties for proof of a kill, and who were not particular about how they obtained it. They would stir up trouble, create an incident, and then blame it on the local tribes, giving them an excuse to hunt and collect their blood money. She had to get back to Karuk, to warn him. She began to back away slowly, her movements careful, silent, but her luck had run out. A twig snapped under her boot with the sound of a pistol shot. One of the men, a large, thick-set brute with a red beard and eyes like chips of cold blue ice, turned his head. His gaze swept the tree line and locked onto hers. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well now," he drawled, his voice carrying easily in the tense air. "Look what we have here, a little bird hiding in the bushes." Two of his companions spurred their horses, crashing through the willows. Eleanor scrambled to her feet and ran, but it was hopeless. They were on her in seconds, one of them leaning down from his saddle to grab a fistful of her coat, hauling her off her feet. She was dragged, stumbling, into the middle of the street and thrown down before the red-bearded man who had dismounted. He loomed over her, smelling of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. "The schoolteacher," he said, the smile never leaving his face. "Heard you took a swim in the creek a while back. They say the Crow renegade, Tawena, was with you before he drowned." He let out a harsh laugh. "Funny thing, that we've been tracking him, and his tracks don't look like a dead man's tracks." He reached down and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. "He is out there, isn't he? You have been hiding him." He tightened his grip, his fingers bruising her flesh. "You are going to be our guest for a while, Miss Whitlow. A man might come back for what is his, especially a man with a $500 price on his head." He tied her hands in front of her and shoved her toward the schoolhouse. The town was burning. The fire that had started at the saloon had spread, the dry timber of the cabins catching with a hungry roar. Black smoke billowed into the gray sky, carrying with it the sounds of destruction and the cries of the townspeople. It was an image of hell, a world consumed by senseless, greedy violence. From his vantage point high on the ridge, Karuk saw the smoke. It was a dark stain against the clouds, a signal of profound wrongness. He moved through the trees with the silence of a hunting wolf, his every sense alert. As he drew closer, the sounds of the attack reached him, the smell of the fire stinging his nostrils. He saw the strange riders, the burning cabins, and then he saw them dragging Eleanor into the schoolhouse. His world, which had been rebuilt around the quiet warmth of her presence, fractured. A cold, clean rage settled over him, a warrior's spirit that had been dormant for too long. He knew what this was. He knew these men. They were the scavengers who followed in the wake of war, profiting from death. And they had her. To go down there was to walk into a trap. He was one man against a dozen. But to stay here was to abandon the only part of the world that still had meaning. There was no choice. He began his descent, a shadow moving through the smoke, a hunting knife in one hand, a tomahawk in the other. He used the fire as his ally, the roaring confusion his shield. The hunters were drunk on their victory, their senses dulled by whiskey and adrenaline. They did not see the ghost that slipped between the burning buildings, a figure of silent, deadly purpose. The battle, when it came, was not a noble clash. It was a brutal, desperate affair fought in the swirling smoke and the hellish, dancing light of the flames. Karuk was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his movements economical and lethal. He was fighting not for land or for honor, but for a single life, and it gave him a strength that bordered on the supernatural. 2 of the hunters fell before they even knew he was there. The red-bearded leader roared in fury and surprise, turning to face this sudden, deadly apparition. He was a big man, strong and vicious, a brawler who relied on brute force. He fired his pistol, the shot going wide in the chaos. Karuk closed the distance, his tomahawk a blur. The fight devolved into a primal struggle in the mud and ash, surrounded by a wall of fire. Inside the schoolhouse, Eleanor heard the shift in the sounds outside, the screams of pain that were different from the cries of the miners. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he had come for her. She strained against the ropes that bound her hands, her eyes searching for a weapon, for any advantage. The fight outside was turning. Karuk was a warrior born, but he was outnumbered. Another hunter joined the fray, then another. A knife wound opened on his arm. A glancing blow from a rifle butt sent him stumbling. The fire was closing in, the schoolhouse itself beginning to smolder. The heat was immense, the air thick with smoke that burned the lungs. The world was a roaring, suffocating furnace, a battleground where the hatred of men and the fury of nature had combined. Eleanor saw her chance. The man guarding her had turned his attention to the fight. She kicked out with all her strength, catching him behind the knee. He grunted and fell, and she scrambled for the knife that had fallen from his belt. Her bound hands were clumsy, but she managed to grip it, sawing at the ropes until they fell away. She burst from the schoolhouse just as the red-bearded leader brought the barrel of his rifle down in a vicious arc. Kuruk, already weakened, could not fully dodge. The blow caught him high on the chest and shoulder, and he went down with a cry of pain. The leader raised the rifle like a club, ready for the final blow. Eleanor screamed his name, a raw, piercing sound that cut through the roar of the fire. She ran forward, brandishing the small knife, a desperate, hopeless gesture. But it was enough. The leader turned for a split second, distracted by this new, unexpected threat. It was the only opening Kuruk needed. He surged up from the ground, driving his own knife deep into the man's side. The leader staggered back, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief, before collapsing into the mud. The remaining hunters, their leader fallen, their nerve broken, fled into the smoke-shrouded forest. Silence fell, a heavy, ringing quiet broken only by the hungry crackle and roar of the flames. Pine Hollow was an inferno. The forest itself was on fire, the great trees turning into torches that lit the sky with an apocalyptic orange glow. Kuruk lay on the ground, trying to push himself up, but his strength failed him. A dark stain was spreading across his chest. He was badly wounded. Eleanor rushed to his side. Falling to her knees in the ash, the fire was all around them. A closing circle of heat and destruction. They had to move. They had to get out. She put her shoulder under his, trying to lift him, just as she had done all those months ago on the banks of the creek. But he was a dead weight now, his consciousness fading. Tears of smoke and terror streamed down her face. She would not let him die here. She would not let the fire have him. She grabbed him under the arms and began to drag him. It was a slow, agonizing process. Her muscles screamed in protest. The heat was scorching, her hair and clothes singed. She was moving backward, pulling him away from the worst of the flames, toward the creek, the only place that offered sanctuary from this world of fire. His body left a shallow trench in the muddy, ash-strewn ground. Every inch was a victory. She looked down at her own hands, raw and blistered, gripping his buckskin shirt. They were trembling, not from the cold this time, but from the heat, from the exertion, from the sheer, terrifying force of her will. They were trembling, but they were not weak anymore. The world was born anew in shades of gray. Dawn arrived not with color, but with a slow, reluctant lifting of the dark, revealing a landscape of absolute devastation. The fire had consumed Pine Hollow, leaving behind the blackened skeletons of cabins, their chimneys standing like tombstones in a field of ash and ruin. A thin, acrid smoke still hung in the air, a ghost of the night's fury, mingling with the mist that rose from the creek. The only sound was the steady, indifferent murmur of the water and the occasional soft hiss as a lingering ember finally surrendered to the damp morning air. Eleanor sat on the muddy bank, a small, solitary figure in the vastness of the destruction. She had dragged him here, to the edge of the water, the one element that had defied the fire. He lay with his head in her lap, his body unnervingly still. She was covered in soot and grime. Her dress was torn, her hands were blistered, but she felt none of it. Her entire world had contracted to the man she held, to the shallow, ragged rhythm of his breathing. She had spent the last hours of the night in a state of focused, desperate clarity. She had torn strips from her petticoat, soaked them in the cold, clear water of the creek, and had done what she could for his wounds. The knife cuts were clean, manageable, but the other injury, the one inflicted by the crushing blow of the rifle, was deep and mortal. She knew it with a grim certainty. There was a wrongness to the way he lay, a broken stillness that no bandage could mend. She could feel the life slowly, inexorably seeping out of him, draining away into the cold earth. She cleaned the blood and soot from his face with a gentle, practiced hand. The face she had once seen as a mask of savage wildness was now as familiar and as beloved to her as her own. She traced the high line of his cheekbone, the strong set of his jaw. She had learned the map of him in the quiet intimacy of their hidden shelter, had memorized it by the flickering light of their small fire. He was not a warrior now, not a fugitive. He was just Kuruk, her Kuruk. The light grew stronger, a pearlescent glow that illuminated the full scope of the ruin. She could see the remains of her small cabin, the schoolhouse where she had stood and lied to the marshal. It all seemed to belong to a different lifetime, to a woman she no longer knew. That woman had come here seeking refuge from her grief, seeking a place so vast and empty it might absorb her sorrow. She had found something else entirely. She had found a life more real, more potent, and more filled with love than any she had ever imagined. And now she was watching it die. His eyes fluttered open. They were no longer the deep, clear pools she knew. They were clouded with pain, his gaze unfocused. He tried to speak, but the sound was a dry, rasping cough that shook his frame and made her heart clench with a pain that was sharper than any physical blow. "Hush," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Do not speak. Save your strength." He quieted, but his eyes remained on her face, searching. She held his hand, her fingers lacing through his. His skin was cold, a deep, penetrating chill that the rising sun could not touch. She held on tighter, as if she could force her own warmth, her own life, into him through the simple pressure of her hand. They remained that way for a long time as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist. The world was utterly still. It was the stillness after a great storm, the profound, echoing quiet that follows a cataclysm. A single bird, a survivor, began to sing from the top of a scorched pine, its clear notes a fragile testament to the persistence of life. His lips moved again, and this time, a sound emerged, a voice so faint it was little more than a whisper of air. She had to lean down, her ear close to his mouth, to hear him. "The water," he breathed, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "When it stops flowing, they call it ice." She did not understand, but she nodded, smoothing the dark hair back from his forehead. "Yes," she murmured, her voice a soothing lie. "It will be warm soon. The ice is gone." He gathered what was left of his strength, a flicker of the old intensity returning to his eyes. He was looking at her, but also through her, seeing something far beyond the ash and the ruin. "But when the heart," he whispered, each word an immense effort, "when the heart stops being afraid, they call it love." The words settled over her, not with a shock, but with the quiet, devastating finality of truth. It was his last lesson, his final gift. It was the key to everything, to the creek, to their meeting, to the long winter, to the fire. Her fear had been a kind of ice, a frozen state of grief that had held her captive. His fear was one of injustice, of exile, and in the small, hidden spaces of the forest, they had found a place where that fear could thaw, where their hearts, no longer afraid of the world or of each other, could finally flow into one another. It was love. He had given it a name, a definition as simple and as profound as the elements themselves. A single tear escaped her and fell onto his cheek. He seemed to feel its warmth. A faint, slow smile touched his lips. It was a smile of peace, of acceptance. He looked at her one last time, his dark eyes holding all the unspoken words, all the shared moments, all the silent prayers. Then he took a long, slow breath, a gentle sigh, and did not take another. The stillness that followed was absolute. The weight of him in her lap changed, became heavier, more final. The light in his eyes dimmed and went out, leaving only the beautiful, empty shells. He was gone. The bird in the pine tree continued to sing its defiant, hopeful song, but she could no longer hear it. The only sound was the roaring silence in her own ears. She did not move. She did not weep. She simply held him, her arms wrapped around his shoulders. her face buried in his hair, which still smelled of wood smoke and pine. She held him as the sun rose higher, casting long, stark shadows across the ruined valley. She was a statue of grief, a monument to a love that had been born in the water and had died in the ashes. Time lost its meaning. There was only the before and the now. But as the hours wore on, another sound began to penetrate her consciousness, a sound that had been there all along, a sound that was the heartbeat of this place. It was the murmur of the creek, the endless, gentle conversation of the water flowing over stone. It was the sound that had been the backdrop to their entire story. She listened, and in the soft, rhythmic burble of the current, she heard something else. It was not a voice. It was not a memory. It was a presence. It was the feeling of his spirit, released from its broken vessel, rejoining the world that had made him. He was in the whisper of the water, in the patient strength of the stones, in the deep, silent life that flowed on, unstoppable. He had not left her. He had simply changed form. The water remembered, and as long as it flowed, he would be there. The years fell away like leaves in autumn, each one leaving the world a little different, a little more worn. The woman who now walked the dusty tracks between the new, raw-boned towns of the territory was not the Eleanor Whitlow who had arrived from Boston. The eastern fragility had been burned out of her, replaced by a quiet, resilient strength, like a tree that has learned to bend with the wind. Her skin was tanned by the sun, her hair streaked with an early gray, and her eyes, once clouded with a private sorrow, were now as clear and as deep as a mountain lake, holding the vast, quiet wisdom of the wilderness. She was no longer a teacher of letters and sums. She had become a keeper of stories. She traveled alone, with a small pack and a sturdy walking stick, and wherever she found a group of children gathered, near a mining camp or a new ranch house, she would stop. She would sit with them not in a schoolroom, but on the bank of a river or under the shade of a cottonwood tree, and she would teach them. She taught them about the land, not from a book, but as she had been taught. She showed them how to read the stories written in the mud, how to know the call of the goshawk, how to listen to the language of the water. And she would tell them one story, always the same one, though it changed a little in the telling, shaped by the place and the faces of the children before her. She never spoke of the fire, or the bounty, or the blood. She spoke of a man who belonged to the pines, a man whose heart was as strong and as quiet as the ancient stones. She told them how he knew the secret names of the winds, how he could speak with the river, and how his hands, though rough from a hard life, were gentle enough to mend a broken wing. She made him a legend, a spirit of the forest, a piece of the wild, beautiful, an untamable soul of the land itself. She gave his story to the children so that it would live on, woven into the fabric of this place. Long after she was gone, she was planting seeds, and the seeds were the memory of his goodness. One year, in the late autumn when the air grew sharp and the aspens had turned a brilliant, trembling gold, she felt a pull she could no longer ignore. It was time. It had been 20 years. She turned her face toward the mountains that cradled the valley of Pine Hollow, and began the long walk back. The journey was a pilgrimage through memory. The world had changed. The railroad had come through, and with it, more people, more fences, more towns that scarred the landscape with a relentless geometry. But the further she walked, the more the land began to resemble the one she remembered. The mountains were the same, their great, stony faces impassive and eternal. The sky was the same, a vast and aching blue. She was walking not just through space, but through time, back to the place where her life had truly begun and ended in a single, incandescent moment. There was nothing left of Pine Hollow. The forest, with its patient, inexorable power, had reclaimed its own. A thick carpet of grass and wildflowers grew where the muddy street had been. Young pine and aspen trees, already 20 feet tall, grew up through the collapsed skeletons of the cabins. Nature had healed the wound, covering the ashes with a blanket of green. She found a few half-buried foundation stones from the schoolhouse and a single blackened stone chimney, standing like a lone mourner against the sky. There were no ghosts here. The human violence had been a brief, noisy fever, and the land, in its deep, slow wisdom, had simply waited for it to pass. She made her way to the creek. It was exactly as she remembered. The water, clear and impossibly cold, still whispered its endless secrets over the same smooth, gray stones. The great pines still stood on the opposite bank, their boughs sighing in the gentle breeze, their scent a sharp, clean balm in the air. The mist was rising from the water, just as it had on that first morning, a pale, smoky breath that clung to the surface. It was all the same. The stage was set, the actors long gone, but the play, the memory, remained. She walked to the spot where he had pulled her from the water, where he had laid her on the soft bed of pine needles. She could feel the echo of it, a faint tremor in the very ground beneath her feet. This was holy ground. This was the altar where she had been baptized into a new life, and the tomb where she had buried her heart. She knelt slowly, her joints stiff from the long journey. The years fell away completely. She was no longer the wandering storyteller. She was no longer the grieving widow. She was the young woman, gasping for breath, her life hanging by the thread of a stranger's strength. She looked at her own hands. They were wrinkled now, the skin thin over the knuckles, but she saw them as they had been. She remembered their trembling as she had dragged him from the fire, remembered their gentleness as she had cleaned his wounds, remembered their cold emptiness after he was gone. She leaned forward and lowered her right hand, palm down, into the creek. The cold was a shock, a clean, sharp pain that traveled up her arm and into her chest, right to the center of her heart. It was the cold of memory, the cold of loss, but it was also the cold of life, of a moment so pure and so real it had defined all the others that came after. The water flowed over her fingers, a living current, a pulse. She closed her eyes. The murmur of the creek filled her senses, and in it, she could hear him, feel him. He was here. He had always been here. The words rose in her mind, not as a memory, but as a final, quiet truth, a testament spoken to the water, to the pines, to the spirit that inhabited this place. Those hands were once rough, the water was once cold, but when he lifted me from the creek, the world stopped breathing, and I have never lived again in any other way than in that moment. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.